pay as close attention to them as I could. So I just want to expand a little bit on each of those three themes and then move on to the next part of this talk. The encounters. Well, there's just the thing that strikes me when I reviewed the the cases involved, the UFO encounters that took place, is the quantity of well-documented, just astonishing, mind-blowing encounters that took place. Military cases galore, hundreds and hundreds of them. I was fortunate in getting access to a database provided to me by the researcher and former Aerojet employee Ron Regehr. Ron worked on, he was involved in building what was called the DSP satellite, that's Defense Support Program satellites. A very interesting kind of satellite in which Ron argued, I think with a lot of persuasion, that they are designed perfectly to be UFO spotting devices. In any case, Ron was able, accidentally but legally, to obtain a list of DSP tracks of fast walkers during this period of time. In other words, fast walker being a code word for UFO in the upper atmosphere or in space. There were, I'm trying to recall, from 1973 to 91, about 283, I think that's right, fast walker trackings by the DSP satellites during that period of time. It's like one every month or more, 15 a year, I believe. A couple of them were really interesting, one in which an object came in from space and did a U-turn in the vicinity of one of the satellites. There was also a DSP tracking of a UFO during the spectacular 1976 Iranian jet fighter intercept. Many people are familiar with this, and I, again, cover this at length in my book. Make a long story short, in September 1976 over the city of Tehran, and of course this is back in the days of the Shah when Iran was an ally of the United States, a large number of Tehran citizens saw this very unusual object in the evening sky. They called the local airport. The air traffic controller person at first thought it was silly. Then he went out and looked and saw exactly what people were reporting, and he called the Iranian Air Force. They sent 2 F-4 fighter jet interceptors in succession. Now we know all about this because we know a lot about it because we have a very extended Defense Intelligence Agency memo describing this in fascinating detail. And what happened is that in each case of the F-4 encounters, when they got to within a range of 25 nautical miles of this object, which they tracked on airborne radar, which they saw visually, which astonished the pilots, each of them, when they got to within 25 nautical miles, their key electronic systems went offline. In one case, right before one pilot was about to fire a missile at this object, it disabled the missile system. It so happens that we have DSP tracking data of a fast walker in exactly that spot at that time. Pretty interesting confirmation indeed. Back to the quantity of these encounters, and what we find is just an enormous amount of unexplained events going on that any responsible researcher would have to inquire about. Forget the issue initially of aliens. The biggest frustration I have when I talk to skeptics about this is that they jump 10 steps ahead of the argument. And they'll say something like, well, that's impossible because it's impossible for aliens to come here from another planet. Don't you know anything about astrophysics, or space travel, or the impossible? Well, okay, I can't argue that, and I know as well as the next person that we don't have a way ourselves of getting to the nearest star, not officially. But nevertheless, the real issue is in looking at these UFO reports and then trying to make sense out of them. Sure, it's easy to just say it's impossible, but the question is, what do you do with the reports? Well, what most people do is they ignore them, of course. That's the easy thing. A number of other very interesting developments during these years. Abductions, I actually write quite a bit about that phenomenon. And again, I'm going to come back to that shortly. The mutilation phenomenon, is that or is that not related to the UFO phenomenon? I think it is. Crop circles, ditto. I think that there's a relationship there. And all of these I tried to deal with as well as I could. So, concluding provisionally regarding the encounter thread of this book, there's a lot of conclusions we can make. Let's keep it simple. There is an overwhelming evidence for UFO reality. To me, if I were to have the opportunity to speak to somebody on NBC or some major network, this is the message I think that I would emphasize. That let's take one step at a time here. And the evidence is overwhelming. And this was my first primary goal in putting this book together, was to lay that evidence out as persuasively as I could. The politics, I'm going to expand a little bit about this. Let me just put all these out there. We can talk about them at... Oops, okay. There's a lot of themes in my book that deal with what we would call the politics of UFOs. Each of the presidential administrations, I put my timer out here, I did deal with. 1973, we had Richard Nixon still in the White House. There's some pretty good Nixon UFO. There's one great Nixon UFO story. That's the Nixon-Jackie Gleason story, and that's in my book. Jimmy Carter, and the whole, skipping Gerald Ford, through Carter, through the Reagan and Bush years. It turns out that each of these presidents has some fascinating connections to UFO history. So that's one aspect of it. Then the military intelligence community confirmed documents inform a lot of this book as well. One thing that is very clear from looking at the mass of that data is not simply that the phenomenon is real, but that they were very, very concerned about this phenomenon. It makes perfect sense. When you're in charge of managing security over an Air Force base and an object that you can't identify as coming over your base, doing things that are not supposed to be possible. For example, in the wave of airspace violations in 1975 along the northern US border into Canada, over many bases with a Strategic Air Command, triggering maximum level alerts, sirens going, lights flashing, and all of that, with objects hovering 500 feet over weapons storage facilities. Yes, it happened, and it happened multiple times during a brief period in late 1975. And we know for sure that this excited the concern of responsible agencies. We learned about this because we were at a very unique stage in American history in the late 1970s, and that was when the Freedom of Information Act was actually kind of, sort of useful. And back in those days, this was the early Carter years, Jimmy Carter had a very liberal attitude about FOIA and did promote a relative amount of openness in relation to these government documents. There's still a great deal that was never released, and in fact, of all the Freedom of Information Act documents we have, almost none of them were of the level of top secret or above. The highest good ones we have are classified secret and below. There's a couple of documents we have that were top secret, and they're all excised, and blacked out or whited out, so you really can't read what's in them. But nevertheless, a lot of good information came out, and during that period, we learned about these airspace violations in the mid-70s. During the late 70s, early 80s, there's overwhelming evidence to show that intelligence groups infiltrated UFO research organizations. They clearly did this earlier as well. But there's my argument in this book is that circa 1979, 1980, there was an active effort by agencies, once again, to infiltrate the field and to stir up the mud and make it essentially a lot more difficult for us to know what direction is up and what is down. But there's more than this. One of the things that I brought into this volume that I really did not do a lot of in my first book, because I don't think I was there mentally myself 10 years ago, is what I would now call the larger geopolitical realities. Forget UFOs for a moment. I think that most people can now recognize that the United States president is probably not the guy in charge of the country. Okay. So we all know this. So then the question becomes, well, who or what is?